The Great Siege of Malta by Francisco Balbi, Chapter 5. Despite continual bombardment, St. Elmo continues to hold out. Monday the 4th of June. The Grand Master sent Captain Miranda over to St. Elmo, not in a position of command, but as an ordinary soldier, so that he could better judge what needed to be done, and he was received by the garrison with great enthusiasm. As soon as Captain Miranda reached St. Elmo, he found out how the morale of the commanders stood and what strategy the Turks were adopting. He inspected the gun batteries and gave whatever orders seemed necessary for the common good. His reputation was such that he was implicitly obeyed. Returning to Birgu, Miranda reported to the Grand Master. He stated that the fort could not be held for long if the Turks were persistent, because the lack of traverses meant that defenders' fire had little effect. Furthermore, there was no strong point to which the defenders could retire. But he went on to say that every hour St. Elmo held out would be of the greatest help to the rest of the island, and urged that the fort should not be evacuated for as long as possible. The Grand Master had great faith in Captain Miranda and took note of what he said, for he realised that his advice was sound. He then asked him to go over to St. Elmo as governor and take complete control as if he were La Valette himself. Miranda replied, "Heaven forbid I should take charge of such a hopeless task. Afterwards people might say that it was I who lost the fort. Nevertheless, my lord," he went on, "I wish you to have proof that I desire to serve the order, for in doing so I will serve my God and my king. Let me go to St. Elmo as a simple soldier to join these valiant men. I will work in their company for the good of us all and die with them." La Valette, seeing that Miranda would not accept the command, allowed him to go, stressing at the same time how important the defence of the fort was. So Miranda returned to St. Elmo, and the Grand Master gave orders that he should be implicitly obeyed. As soon as he arrived in the fort, Miranda had the alarm sounded in order to test the discipline and to see what state the reserves were in. He gave such orders as he thought necessary for the defence, and sent a message to La Valette that from a morale point of view he should dispatch some money to pay the troops, for nothing makes soldiers happier than money. It was the Bishop of Malta, a very good Christian, who assisted the order financially throughout the siege, as well as making many gifts to the poor and to the infirmary, who advanced the money for this. Miranda also asked for some barrels of wine. Then, when all was ready, he paid the troops. He had gaming tables set up as well as bars, and the troops were naturally delighted. La Valette was still very eager to recapture the Ravelin. To find out if this were possible, he sent the Marshal and Don Constantino Castriota to examine the situation with Miranda. They came back and said it would be a hopeless task and would need more men than they had to spare. La Valette therefore gave up the idea and realised that the only hope of saving St. Elmo lay in its defenders. Captain Fanton, on orders from the Grand Master, now went over to St. Elmo by night to meet a spy, but while he was on shore waiting, his boat's crew heard some noise, rowed off and left the captain behind. He stayed there until daybreak, and then, seeing no boat, rather than being taken by the Turks, he abandoned his arms and swam to safety. After they had captured the Ravelin and raised it to the level of St. Elmo's walls, the Turks built a gun platform on it. Here they mounted 2 cannons and began a frontal bombardment of the fort. Dragut, meanwhile, carried on bombarding St. Elmo's from his side. The enemy also got into the ditch and began building a scaffold bridge opposite the post of Colonel Mass, but they were met by our gunfire and forced to abandon the project. They therefore began to take away stones from the wall and to bring up scaling ladders in order to assault the post. Another bridge was built below the Ravelin and fixed to the wall in front of it, but as soon as the defenders saw it, they determined to sally out by the ditch and see if they could burn it down. Nothing could be done from inside the battlements because of the great number of arquebusiers stationed on the Ravelin, who would have shot them down when they showed their heads. The sortie was made, and there was a bitter struggle throughout the greater part of the night, but in the end our troops were forced to retire. All the same, they had managed to burn 3 of the supports of the bridge, leaving only 2 intact. All the knights and soldiers fought extremely well in this action and inflicted many casualties on the Turks. We had a few wounded and Sergeant Di Medrano killed. The Grand Master now learned that the Bailiff of Negropoint was in a bad way from the arrow wound he had received during the battle for the Ravelin. He also heard that Luigi Brolia, governor of St. Elmo, was ill. Brolia was a very old man, and the strain and continual anxiety had so worn him down that he told the Grand Master that, if it was his wish, he would retire. The bailiff of Negropont sent a message to the effect that although he was rather weak from his wound, he had no intention of leaving the fort. However, if the Grand Master wanted to send someone to take his place, he would willingly serve under him, but he was determined to stay in St. Elmo as a simple knight and to die for the order. Tuesday the 5th of July. The enemy's fire was very heavy. Dragut's 4-piece battery bombarding the tall tower which stands apart from the fort. The battery on the Ravelin was bombarding the wall on its right. The Marsa Machado guns fired on the apex of the spur held by Colonel Mass, while the main battery fired on the whole of the curtain wall as well as the tall tower. Inspired by Dragut, they were always trying to improve their fire, testing the defences at every point and probing for weaknesses. This day there was not a single safe place in all St. Elmo. La Valette, in view of the bailiff of Negropont's condition, appointed Colonel Mass to act as his lieutenant. Hearing that the Turks had reconstructed the bridge yet again, he recalled Juan Vanyan with 100 of his soldiers from Medina and sent them over to St. Elmo. Not for a moment did the bombardment slacken, and now the first 2 batteries on the heights above St. Elmo were engaging St. Angelo as well as bombarding the boats, the windmills and the houses. At the same time, in order to get on with their bridge more quickly, as well as to protect their workmen, the Turks strengthened their garrison on the Ravelin. Picked arquebuses were stationed there to give covering fire to the men working on the bridge and those in the ditch. Realising that the Turks were not to be deflected from their objective, and that there was nothing they could do to stop them, the garrison of St. Elmo decided to send Captain Medrano over to the Grand Master. He was to report on the situation and to submit that it was the opinion of all that the fort could not be held. It had always had many defects, but now their defences were tottering, the enemy's bridge was almost ready, and the increased height of the Ravelin meant that the Turkish fire now commanded the whole fort. The garrison could no longer defend themselves. Captain Medrano went over to Birgu and told the Grand Master how the defenders of St. Elmo felt. There is no need to explain what effect this news had upon La Valette. He knew perfectly well that the longer St. Elmo held out, the greater hope there was for the whole island, since the delay gave them a chance to strengthen the weak points in the rest of the island's defences. He accordingly sent Medrano back to the fort to tell the defenders that the time was not ripe to come to a final decision. He asked them all to do their duty as they had always done, that he was more concerned for them than they believed, and that according to the information he had received, relief could not be long in coming. Friday the 8th of June. All, or nearly all the knights in the garrison wrote to the Grand Master that it was certain death to remain in St. Elmo. They begged him to give them permission to sally out and fight in the open. If fortune favoured them, they might manage to burn or destroy the bridge, or even drive the enemy from the Ravelin. If, on the other hand, they should fail, they would at least die happily. They added that, if they were unsuccessful, they would ensure that the water in the fort was poisoned and the guns spiked. This letter bore the signature of 50 knights. The resolution of these knights weighed heavily upon La Valette, especially since they had all acted together. Had it been a case of only 1 or 2, he could have dealt suitably with them. As it was, he replied that he besought them all, and indeed ordered them, since they were all prepared to death, which would be certain if they were allowed to carry out their proposal, to stay at their posts in St. Elmo. This was essential for the salvation of the order to which they were solemnly bound by their vows, and furthermore, the relief force was hourly expected. This day, the Turks came at Fort St. Elmo from every direction, some to reconnoitre, some to attack it. The latter launched a major assault which was both well organised and determined. Their best and bravest men were detailed for the bridge. To begin with, they attacked with such wild courage that they were like Aphion eaters. Aphion is a kind of drug which has such violent effects that after eating a little of it, men lose their reason and become quite without fear. Aware of the danger, our troops under fire from the Ravelin repulsed them with the utmost valour. No less bravery was shown by the enemy as they charged forward. The bridge was the most critical place, for it was across this that the Turks hoped to reach our fortifications, where every means of defence, from cold steel to rocks and fire, had been called into use. The attack lasted for 7 hours, at the end of which the Turks retired with a loss of more than 500 men, among them many janissaries and fanatics. Our losses were 40 dead, not counting the wounded. The knights and all the soldiers of every nationality conducted themselves most valiantly. After the Turks had withdrawn, a Spanish renegade shouted from their trenches, "You have done well today, knights, but soon you will have to face what you seem to want so much, a general assault." The Grand Master immediately sent boats over to St. Elmo to transfer the wounded to Birgu. Captain Juan de la Cerda was wounded by a musket shot during this engagement, and his wound had only just been attended to after the Turks retired, when the alarm sounded again. He took off his bandage, and weak though he was, returned with great courage to his post. His standard bearer had been in Birgu since the day that the Ravelin was lost, and the Grand Master kept him prisoner there until releasing him. Every day La Valette was kept informed of the weakening position of St. Elmo. The defenders could now hear the sound of tunnelling to the right of the first bridge, and they were afraid that the Turks were preparing a mine. 3 knights, Don Francisco Ruiz de Medina, a Spaniard, Don Constantino Castriota, an Italian, and Antonio La Roccia, a Frenchman, were sent over by the Grand Master to see what chances remained of continuing to defend the fort. When they reached it, they found the garrison so confident that they would be withdrawn that they had already destroyed half their ammunition and some of their arms. They had even begun to throw their cannonballs into the cistern and were planning to blow up the fort. It is rumoured that Colonel Mass was against all these measures. When the defenders learned the object of the knights' visit, they showed them the state of the defences, as far as was possible at night, and asked them for their opinion. Medina was doubtful whether the fort could be defended any longer. La Roccia was more hopeful, but Castriota said that there was no doubt that defence was still possible. All they needed to do was to erect inner defences behind the main curtain and retire behind these. The defenders were astounded by his remarks and pointed out how small the fort was and that there was no materials of any kind for building defences such as these. Moreover, with the Turkish guns already commanding almost the whole of the fort and keeping constant fire on them, how could they possibly defend it? They would be glad to know any solution and begged the 3 knights to stay until the morning, when they would be able to see the conditions properly and so give the Grand Master an accurate account of their situation. As for them, they could see no possible means by which they could save the fort, but, they went on, "Since you knights say that it is possible, stay with us and show us. Together we shall defend it to the death." Don Constantino replied that he did not intend to stay, for they had not been sent across for that purpose. Colonel Mass then had the gates closed and swore that they should not leave whether they wished to or not. The 3 knights then pleaded to be allowed to depart and promised they would make such a report to the council that the garrison would be withdrawn. If the bailiff of Negrepont had not used his wits, however, the 3 knights would have been forced to stay in Fort St. Elmo, but knowing that if this had happened, La Valette would be extremely annoyed, he had the alarm sounded, and the result that every man dashed to his post. The whole garrison had been gathered in the square during the meeting, but now, by means of this trick, the bailiff was able to let the 3 knights out of the fort. They reached Birgu by midnight and the council met immediately. The knights told the whole story but denied the rumour about the mine was true. They said that the Turks had only been taking away stones from the walls to make shelters for themselves. The council was divided over what action to take. Finally, they decided to accept the opinion of the Grand Master and the Admiral, both of whom held that St. Elmo should not be abandoned but reinforced. Don Constantino now proposed that he should undertake its defence, and La Valette told him to put forward his suggestions in council the next morning. In the morning, just as the council was about to debate the matter of St. Elmo, 2 swimmers arrived from the fort, each bringing a letter. The first stated that the garrison was in a state of complete confusion and despair and demanded that arrangements should be made for withdrawing them. In the second letter, it would seem that they complained about the Grand Master and the council for not having arranged the evacuation of the fort and not sending them sufficient equipment for the defence. They asked for the things they needed to be sent over together with reinforcements, but they stated that they were determined to hold the fort to the end. This second message was sent because they had been told that Don Constantino had offered to go and defend St. Elmo, and if this had happened, all the knights and soldiers would have felt disgraced. Don Constantino stated that he would need 500 men and also ammunition to go to the defence of St. Elmo, but he added that he must be given complete authority over the knights that went with him. Although some still maintain that the fort ought to be abandoned, Don Constantino's offer was accepted. La Valette ordered him to make his preparations, to raise his standard and have his drums beaten to summon volunteers. The Grand Master gave permission for men to leave their posts and their companies so that they might go to St. Elmo. The money for paying these troops was again provided by the Bishop of Malta, and amounted to 2,000 ducats. La Valette now wrote to the knights in St. Elmo saying he felt sorry that men who had already given ample proof of their bravery should abandon the fort. He reminded them also of the vows they had taken when they had entered the order. He wrote to Miranda telling him not to forget the confidence La Valette had placed in him, and that since he knew what Don Garcia had said, that the relief force should arrive soon, he must do his best to persuade the mutineers to stay and defend St. Elmo. When Miranda received the letter, he and the bailiff addressed the garrison. So eloquent were they, that all with one accord said that they did not want to leave, but that reinforcements and ammunition should be sent over, and that they would all die in St. Elmo. A message was dispatched to the Grand Master telling him of their resolve. La Valette at once sent 100 soldiers under Orazio Martello, as well as money and ammunition. In order to make the enemy think that a much larger relief force was arriving, the troops carried with them a great number of banners. Throughout this period, Commander Melchior de Montserrat, a knight from Valencia, had been visiting St. Elmo on his own to keep an eye on things, and on a number of occasions he had told La Valette that the fort ought not to be abandoned. Being in need of an able man officially to replace Brolia as governor, La Valette asked Montserrat if he would be prepared to take over Brolia's duties. He at once replied that he was always willing to do his duty in the service of God and the order. Accordingly, he was sent to St. Elmo by the Grand Master and the council, and a devout Capuchin friar of the Order of St. Francis, to whom Montserrat was deeply attached, accompanied him to the fort. On reaching St. Elmo, the friar preached a sermon encouraging the garrison and putting new heart into them for the fight. After hearing his words, the men felt strengthened and consoled, and ready for whatever might befall. Luigi Brolia and the friar then left and returned to Birgu. Among other events at this time, Commander Sagra was wounded and was sent back to Birgu, his place being taken by Antonio Grugno. We found out from a renegade who fled to Birgu that on the day that the Ravelin was taken and the bridge was attacked, the Turkish losses had been very heavy, much greater than anything they had expected. Fearing not only the loss of St. Elmo, but even greater misfortune, La Valette now had a gun platform constructed on the site of the windmills. Reinforced with earth and stones, it was built on a high point from which it could give covering fire to the post of Don Francisco de Sanaguera, which was weak and vulnerable. When the platform was finished, 2 large guns and 2 medium-sized ones were mounted on it, covering the Marsa and the mouth of the harbour. Hasdrubal de Medici was in command, assisted by some Italian knights and soldiers. Casualties in St. Elmo were heavy, increasing every day. Indeed, in one day alone, the Turks killed 21 of our sentries. Hearing this, the Grand Master sent a dispatch to the governor of Medina, ordering him to send down some of the men who had sought safety in the old city. Sunday the 10th of June. La Valette had ammunition sent to St. Elmo, together with some new devices which are believed to have been the invention of a knight called Ramon Fortune. These were barrel hoops covered with caulking material and saturated in a cauldron of boiling pitch. Another layer of caulking material was then wound round them, and they were once more dipped in pitch. This process was repeated until they were as thick as a man's leg. During an enemy attack, they were set alight and flung among the enemy, wreaking considerable havoc. The Turks now began transporting loads of earth and fascines into the ditch, and near the place where they had built the first bridge, they began raising ladders in order to attack the post of Colonel Mass. But during the night, our troops sallied out, and to the chagrin of the Turks managed to burn down a large section of the bridge. In this action, all the knights and troops taking part did very well. During the day, the Turks bombarded St. Elmo from all quarters right up to noon, when they made a large-scale attack, although it could not be called a general assault. A bloody battle followed, the Turks finally retiring with considerable losses, while we for our part had a number killed and a great many wounded. Once the Turks had withdrawn, the bombardment recommenced. They kept this up until the third watch of the night, when they again attacked. There was no question of this being a reconnaissance, for they brought up a great number of scaling ladders and massed near the bridge and the spur of Colonel Mass, shouting war cries and making fearsome noises. Although it was night, the immense number of flares and incendiaries used by both sides meant that there was no darkness. We, who were in the garrison of St. Michael, could see Fort St. Elmo quite clearly, while the gunners in St. Angelo and the other positions were able to lay their guns by the light of the enemy's fires. The attack kept up until dawn. When the Turks retired, they had lost over 1,000 men, the highest percentage of their casualties being caused by our fire hoops. We had 60 men killed and many wounded, the latter being sent over immediately to Birgu. The knights and soldiers of the various nations had fought with the greatest bravery, and not only they, but even the convicts and the mercenary oarsmen. Monday the 11th of June. Soon after midday, the enemy, smarting from their heavy losses, began a furious bombardment. All morning they had been busy recovering their dead, while we were burying ours and sending our wounded over to the infirmary, where they were already more than 200. During the night, the Grand Master sent 150 men to St. Elmo, together with ammunition, and a great number of baskets, mattresses, and piles of unravelled rope yarn. These were designed to be used in place of fascines for repairing the defences. Meanwhile, in Birgu also, no time was lost in improving the defences. Tuesday the 12th of June. The Turks made no attacks, but maintained a furious bombardment all day and all night on every quarter of the fort. Our garrison in St. Elmo took what cover they could, but had not a moment's rest. At midday, Kurtoli, one of the Turkish leaders, was killed by a shot from one of St. Angelo's guns. He was in the trenches in front of St. Elmo, observing the effects of the Turkish fire. During the day, Bajada arrived from Medina with the news that the cavalry had captured a janissary and 2 workmen. These had said that the Turkish losses on the previous night had been very heavy and that all their wounded were dying. They said also that provisions were very scarce in the army and the labourers were rationed to 10 ounces of biscuit a day, that many men were dying from disease. Bajada was a Maltese who had once been a Turkish slave and spoke their language very fluently. He was a magnificent swimmer and served the order very well throughout the siege. A vessel was dispatched by the Pashas to Tripoli, together with a barge and 4 galleys. These, so we learned from renegades, were full of sick and wounded. It was planned that they should return with provisions for the army, since they were short of honey, oil, raisins, butter, and other delicacies which the Muslims relish. Just about sundown, Dragut sailed out of Master Schlock with 60 ships. He followed the coastline until he was abreast Gallows Point, whence he set course for Sicily. As we learned afterwards from renegades, he wanted his movements to be seen from Birgu, hoping to deceive the Grand Master and make him think that he was on his way to intercept some force destined for our relief. In fact, soon after nightfall, he returned to his former anchorage. Wednesday the 13th of June. A renegade came over to us with the information that there were considerable ill feelings between the Pashas and the Janissaries. The Pashas were reproaching the Janissaries for calling themselves the sons of the Sultan, and for their many other brave boasts. Yet still they had not got the spirit to take a small, weak and ruined fort against which a bridge had already been laid. The Janissaries, for their part, replied that when the artillery had levelled the walls, as it ought to do, they would show that they merited their reputation. By day and night the enemy kept up a ceaseless bombardment of Fort St. Elmo. At every hour there were calls to arms, while the Turkish reconnaissance forays were more like assaults, and on every occasion both sides suffered a number of losses. Their intention in all this was to wear down the defenders and give them no rest. Thursday the 14th of June. The bombardment continued ceaselessly throughout the day and night. After dark, the Turks carried a lot of earth and bundles of brushwood into the ditch, but most of the wood was set on fire by the defenders. What was more, our artillery killed the agate of the Janissaries when he was in their trenches. Friday the 15th of June. A major assault which lasted 4 hours was made in the morning. The enemy retired with heavy losses, but nevertheless attacked again in the afternoon and kept up the attack until dark. Neither of these attacks was what one might call a general assault, but they were made in force with great determination and caused considerable losses on both sides. Over 400 Turks and 60 Christians were killed, and we had as many wounded. These, as usual, were transferred to Birgu. The commanders in St. Elmo sent a dispatch to La Valette telling him the position and saying that they expected a general assault the next day. They asked for reinforcements of men, ammunition and other supplies. The Grand Master quickly met their demands. Throughout the dark hours, the bombardment of the fort continued, the enemy making innumerable false alarms to harass our troops and prevent them resting. These alarms and excursions gave the defenders no time to repair the fortifications, since they were continually forced to stand to arms. All this was a clear indication that an assault was coming. Among the many trials of the defenders was the necessity of having to procure earth for repairing the fortifications, the incessant bombardment having blown away all that had been taken into St. Elmo before the siege started. Sappers were forced to go out and dig for it, and in the course of this, many of them were killed. End of chapter 5.